Welcome to the Molecules and Minerals Podcast. I'm Stephen Goldman. I'm a former trial lawyer, corporate director, executive, and a biotech investor. I'm here today with Dr. James Helliwell. He's the CEO of Eupraxia Pharmaceuticals. Eupraxia's common shares trade both on the Toronto Stock Exchange and Nasdaq under symbol EPRX. Eupraxia is leveraging its proprietary Diffusphere technology to optimize drug delivery. Its drug candidates are designed to provide extended release activity for months, a year, or even longer, combined with an improved pharmacokinetics and related safety profile and precision-targeted local delivery. Its lead investigational drug is EP104GI. It's an extended-release, injectable drug version of a well-known steroid, fluticasone propionate. Eupraxia encapsulates this drug with its Diffusphere technology and is testing it both in the Resolve Phase 1b/2a trial and the Phase 2b trial in patients suffering from eosinophilic esophagitis, or EoE. EoE is a chronic, progressive inflammation of the esophagus, which leads to painful and difficult swallowing and food impaction. Uncontrolled, it can lead to fibrostenosis, where a buildup of scarring tissue reduces flexibility and function and may cause narrowing and blocking of the esophagus. EoE has experienced a rapid increase in incidence, particularly in the US and Europe. Not long ago, it was classified as a rare disease, but now the estimated number of EoE patients is closer to 470,000 in the U.S. alone, and is expected to grow to approximately 1 million patients by 2030. Esophagitis disease is further compounded by mental health issues, including anxiety, depression, symptoms, hypervigilance, and social isolation. EoE patients are typically treated by gastroenterologists who conduct annual endoscopies to monitor and take biopsies. These specialists currently prescribe one or more combinations of a restricted diet, proton pump inhibitors or PPI, corticosteroids, or new drugs such as the blockbuster Dupixent, which is a weekly injectable owned by Regeneron and Sanofi that costs $100,000 per year. Each of these treatments has its drawbacks, including side effects and poor adherence and compliance issues. There is a huge unmet need for an effective new treatment for EoE that solves the issues of efficacy, safety, and compliance. Eupraxia aims to help fill that unmet need with its EP104GI, which is injected directly into the esophagus, which is the GI tract, during routine annual endoscopies, anticipated to be injected once yearly. Eupraxia recently released some very promising Phase 1b/2a clinical trials results, albeit in a relatively small number of patients in 9 cohort groups, which Dr. Helliwell will discuss in some detail. Eupraxia expects to release interim results by the end of this year from a larger 120-patient placebo-controlled Phase 2b Resolve trial, testing 2 different doses of EP104GI with outcomes for safety, pharmacokinetics, and efficacy being collected up to 52 weeks post-dosing. If the interim results meet their various endpoints for safety and efficacy, this could be a meaningful catalyst for Eupraxia and its various stakeholders. If successful, Eupraxia plans to hold an end-of-Phase 2 meeting with the FDA in the first half of 2027 and plan a Phase 3 registrational trial for EP104GI for the treatment of EoE to begin in mid-2027, with the hope that it will ultimately lead to commercial approval in the USA and elsewhere. If EP104GI is ultimately approved by the FDA, there will be a lot of financial incentives for U.S. gastroenterologists to use EP104GI because the injections, likely in 20 injections done over a 5 to 10 minute time span can be incorporated into the annual endoscopies for which gastroenterologists can charge additional fees. There also appears to be a lucrative opportunity for gastroenterologists, at least those based in the USA, to, quote, buy and bill, end quote, the drug with the potential to upcharge from 4% up to 20% on the cost of the drug, estimated to be in the $50,000 range, with additional profits being earned by them on each procedure. Assuming that EP104GI is shown to be safe, effective, and capable of being injected annually during an endoscopy, the economic drivers of this drug for gastroenterologists could be quite powerful and, in my view, potentially help rapidly drive adoption in what is a multi-billion-dollar market. For further insight on the potential benefits of EP104GI as a potential treatment and as a tool for practicing gastroenterologists, I recommend watching the July 30th Key Opinion Leader webinar available on Eupraxia's website. I'll also post a link to that KOL talk in the notes below. Of course, Eupraxia is a pre-commercial biotech company, so should still be considered a high-risk investment at this stage. Certainly, there is potential upside for risk-tolerant investors who should conduct their own due diligence before making an investment in Eupraxia. So now I would like to introduce Dr. James Helliwell, CEO of Eupraxia. So James, thank you for agreeing to be my guest today. Can you tell us a little bit about your personal background and the history of Eupraxia?
Yeah, absolutely. Stephen, thank you very much for having me today. It's a real pleasure. And thanks to your listeners for being here. My background is I'm a physician. Interestingly, I did history and philosophy for my undergrad. I actually started law school and always thought being a trial lawyer would be great. I left law school partway through, realizing actually my passions lay more in the medicine side of things. So I went to medical school, became a cardiac anesthesiologist. So what does that mean? It means I lived my life essentially in an operating room. And in that operating room, primarily I focused on complex heart surgeries and heart transplants, and also then the care of those patients afterwards in the critical care unit. In treating those really sick patients in the operating room and in the critical care unit, what really became clear was that precision really mattered. And so it was about getting the right drug and at the right dose, but also to the right place. And so in the operating room, I could do that with a catheter. I could put a catheter and target just the right heart. I could target this part of the body, that part of the body. I could do something inhaled through a breathing tube directly into the lungs and be very, very targeted. Same thing in the critical care unit. As soon as patients left that environment, they were back to standard drug delivery, whether it was oral, IV, a subcutaneous injection. The drug would go everywhere and it would have a burst at the beginning and drop off. As we all know from drugs, when we get side effects, almost all the time those side effects are related to too much of a drug. And when the drug doesn't work, it's often related to too little of the drug. And so the goal was to bring those two edges together. And the technology that I wanted to create that led to me starting this company was really doing that, was to be able to be precise, to be able to target a tissue with exactly the drug that we wanted at the dose that we wanted, and make it really predictable. And also for the long term, the goal being to be able to be sort of easy for patients. And I look back, my hospital was one of the big HIV hospitals back when HIV/AIDS really didn't have good therapies. And the initial therapies were so complicated to take. It was a whole bunch of different pills, this one with food, this one without food, don't take this one close to that one. No one could figure out what to do. And it was when you saw these new drugs come in that made timing easier, compliance easier. And so what does that boil down to? Well, Eupraxia's purpose is to deliver better therapies to patients that are safer, that are more effective, that are more convenient, that also understand how a physician's practice actually works and lives within the confines of that. If you want to give a therapy to a patient and it is inconvenient for the doctor or hurts the doctor's practice, it's very hard to make a go of it. And then the last piece is the payers. whatever your payer is, whether it's, a Medicare, Medicaid, whether it's private insurance, they want to ensure that they are giving drugs that work. And so all of that really formed, this is my background and my motivation for why I started Eupraxia. And so that's my background.
It appears you've been successful in accomplishing that. I certainly got that when I was listening to your KOL talk that I referenced a few minutes ago. So I encourage listeners to watch that. But how did Eupraxia end up with its Diffusphere platform technology? And I noted from, reviewing your filings that you have a licensing agreement with a company called Oratech.
Yeah. So Oratech, back in the early days, when I was starting the company, I'm not a PhD, not a chemist, and knew what the principle was that I wanted to do, which is what I just described. Talked to a lot of polymer chemists, and what they universally said was, you can't do what you're describing. You can't deliver this sort of molecule that remains the same size for a really long period of time. And you can't, what they do is rely on degradation. And so that means it makes a whole bunch of polymer and it breaks apart, releasing the drug that's trapped inside. That wasn't what we wanted to do. The only person that we found that had any patents that was doing this was this company, Oratech. They were based in California. They're a small research shop. They don't produce drugs. They don't do late phase trials. They're not a development company. And so what we did was license in their technology. Now, as it turns out, that technology didn't work to actually do everything that we wanted to do. And so we then learned from failure and developed our own techniques and our own way of doing it that then formed our own basis of the delivery technology and our own patents that were filed years after we'd done the agreement with Oratech. And so really what we're based on is our own technology built in-house. But in a nod to Oratech's contribution in our early days, we're honoring our agreement with them, and of our first product, they will see a healthy reward.
That is interesting because I know, so there is a royalty that you ultimately have to pay in addition to some milestone payments, and the royalty is 4%. Is that on all of your products, or will that be specifically for this one developed for EoE?
Specifically to our first product.
That makes a lot of sense. So what led Eupraxia to develop EP104GI specifically for the treatment of EoE?
Yeah. So we were actually busy working first on osteoarthritis. So we had EP104, fluticasone propionate, a really well-known steroid. If people have taken Flonase, Flovent, Advair, they've taken fluticasone. So there's about 20 million people a day on this drug. So exceptionally well characterized. So many people are on it. So in other words, there's no mystery with the drug. We know what it does and we know what it doesn't do. And so we started in osteoarthritis, and we actually took that very far, and we got right through our phase 2 trial and had our end of phase 2 meeting with the FDA, and everything was positive. We demonstrated there that we basically got some of the best efficacy in osteoarthritis, some of the best safety in osteoarthritis. Our data was published in The Lancet, and we had a very successful meeting with the FDA. Being a small company, though, you have to make choices. We also, at the same time, had our gastroenterology program that was starting to deliver data from our 1b/2a trial. And this is where, you kind of have to decide which one of your children
Yes.
is prettier, and because you can't afford to feed them both. And both were going to require a big trial. So either the phase 3 for osteoarthritis or the phase 2b for gastroenterology. And this is where that commercial dynamic comes into play. It was clear that in both we were having a very good impact on patients. It was clear that both were fairly large market. Clearly, osteoarthritis, a much larger market. The commercial dynamics of osteoarthritis, though, are very different. It is an absolute commodity. And so as a result, pricing is commoditized. And so the opportunity to actually create a product, get it to market in a way where you can make it good for the patients, good for the physicians, good for the payers, and good for the investors who supported it is very different than in gastroenterology. In gastroenterology, as you pointed out, the mainstay of treatment today is either off-label steroids, which are quite expensive, all the way up to a once-a-week injection, whose wholesale cost is $109,000. So even with a bunch of discounts, that becomes, a $70,000, $80,000 a year product. If you can then come along with a once-a-year product and come in with a pricing of $50,000, you're making it a win for every single player in that and delivering better patient care. And so it was a very strategic decision on our part to pivot to gastroenterology. And we've been pleased with that pivot, both because EoE, we're seeing the data that you described so well, but also that data in our interactions with the gastroenterologists, they're now coming to us and saying, we think there's other places in gastroenterology this drug will be very useful.
I agreed with your analysis when I read about it immediately. Let's get into EoE itself. It was considered a rare disease not that long ago, and now we see the incidence seems to be rising very rapidly, particularly in the US and Europe. What's caused that dramatic increase in incidence?
Yeah. So a lot of it is awareness. And this is awareness not just in the public, but also in the physician world. So, I don't like to think of myself as too old. I'm no longer young, but when I went to medical school, EoE wasn't a disease.
Yeah.
We didn't know about it. We didn't talk about it. There may have been some hyper specialists doing research, but when we would see patients, and I remember in my training, seeing patients come to the emergency room with food stuck in their esophagus. Imagine you're out for dinner with your family. You're just trying to eat, and all of a sudden your food is stuck. Water won't even go down. It hurts. It feels like you're having a heart attack. When we look at that, it becomes one of those things that we used to look, we'd take the food out, and then we would make sure there wasn't cancer. And so what would happen there is that patients would have no diagnosis. And we would say,
Right.
chew more, don't have steak with bread, drink more water. And so once EoE was established and people said, oh, we see this inflammatory marker, eosinophils, these white blood cells, and we see this inflammation, the specialists started treating it. And they started treating it, but we're only discovering it late in the disease. So it's kind of like if you only discovered cancer when it was really big and it traveled everywhere. So it was stage 4. As people learned about it and started looking for it, they find it earlier. So now we're diagnosing people before they have a food impaction event, before the disease is really bad. And so now they're basically saying, look, if you have difficulties or pain swallowing food, you very likely have EoE. You should go get scoped and biopsied. A lot of patients are misdiagnosed as heartburn, reflux patients. And there's a beautiful article in the New York Times called The Mystery of My Burning Esophagus. It's an op-ed published a couple of years ago. And it describes this poor author's journey of 10 years of food getting stuck and bouncing from doctor to doctor to doctor before getting that EoE diagnosis. Fortunately for patients today, all the doctors are much more aware and looking for it. What that's led to? Well, that's led to the rise from 150,000 patients to close to 1 million. We're looking for it, so we're finding it.
What's the current standard of care for this disease? And just generally, what are the pros and cons?
Yeah, so the first thing is proton pump inhibitors. We think of them broadly in the lay world as antacids, and they are what are prescribed for reflux patients. Because so many patients are misdiagnosed reflux patients, essentially, they're already on a PPI. And if you take them off, their symptoms get worse. So they remain on the PPI. So that is considered first-line treatment. The downside of it is, when you talk to the doctors, they will say, everybody progresses. In other words, the fibrostenosis, that scar tissue that makes the esophagus a rigid lead pipe and narrow, the PPIs don't stop that and don't solve that. So the next step then is steroids. So that is using fluticasone, so the drug we're using, or budesonide, another inhaled steroid. Now here, these are actually shown to work very well. How do you take them? That's the problem. What you have to do is you either puff it in your mouth and try and swallow it instead of inhaling it, or you actually go to a pharmacy and they give you the powder and they mix it together to make it into a slurry, or you mix it together with honey and try and swallow it. Now, when you swallow it, it's going to coat your esophagus. But the problem is you now can't eat or drink. If you have a sip of water, the drug's gone. So you do that twice a day, no eating or drinking for 2 hours afterwards. Well, that's just not practical. And nobody actually adheres to that. And so while the drug works, if you adhere to that, you'll get a fungal infection in your mouth at least 25% of the time, if not more, which makes people discontinue. But the reality is 70% of people in the United States who are on the steroid treatment discontinue. They just can't do it. Then there's really just one drug left. That one drug left is Sanofi Regeneron's Dupixent. Dupixent is used in, people will have seen TV ads for it in atopic dermatitis or asthma, and these days, maybe even EoE. EoE is its smallest market. It is normally given once every 2 weeks for all the other indications. When they tested that, it didn't work in EoE. So they have to give it once a week. At once a week, you've doubled the cost of the therapy. Also means you're injecting yourself once a week. Now, to be clear, this has been a huge positive change for patients. So that is a good level of therapy. Obviously, we always want to do better. The inconvenience is that it's a once a week injection. What people really want is that level of therapy, that if they can get it on an annual basis is ideal, get it in a less painful, more convenient way. And ideally also, if something is a little bit cheaper as well, that's certainly going to help promote uptake. And that's all we have right now. There have been other companies that have targeted eosinophils with a variety of different products, all biologics. All of them have failed. And interestingly, where they've failed is not in getting rid of the eosinophils. They did a great job of that. What they didn't do was make patients feel better. And what they also didn't do was reverse or stop that fibrosis, which is really critical to do.
In my preparation for our call today, I read a number of analysts' reports on Eupraxia and your drug, and it seems that they're looking at how to measure success, and they're looking at how your drug would compare to Dupixent. And I think you articulated the benefits of Dupixent and also the drawbacks. I understand that Dupixent doesn't specifically break out the sales revenues attributable to EoE, but at least from what I read, it's not far under $1 billion a year. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, so we look to the same things you look to see that, and you're right, they don't break it out. What they have done is break out some things. So, for example, about a year ago, they reported that they'd had 54,000 prescriptions for Dupixent. For EoE. Now, we don't know, how long those people stayed on it, were they compliant, all the rest of that. Most of the estimates that we see by analysts who cover Sanofi Regeneron, really everybody puts them north of $1 billion. And the range is between $1.5 billion and $2.5 billion. But what's clear is it's still just scratching the surface of the market, because if you think about their price at a wholesale price of roughly $100,000, even if you discount that 30%, you look at their own numbers of 54,000 patients, which was a little bit ago, who'd been prescribed this. Clearly, two things are happening. The number of prescriptions they're giving for EoE is going up very rapidly, but they're still just getting a small percentage of the market. And so what that says is there's a lot of room for Dupixent to grow. And there's a lot of room for other entrants into the market. No drug works in everybody. And when you look across many of these complex diseases, it becomes multimodal therapy. If we continue to see the success that we've seen in our clinical data, and this drug has the good fortune to be approved, yes, I believe it will be monotherapy for many patients, but I absolutely can imagine gastroenterologists combining it with Dupixent and saying these two together are giving us the best result. So it's an interesting time ahead for the disease and for patients.
Well, your point is well taken, and I note that Dupixent was only more recently approved for EoE. I believe it was 2022, so they're really just getting going. It's a large market, and we're really talking primarily the US market. Maybe we can talk a little bit about how EP104 GI works and its advantages. I think that understanding how it works and how it fits into a gastroenterologist's practice is part of the key to understanding the commercial value of your drug.
Absolutely. When we look first at the how it works, which is we've created the Diffusphere, which is our platform, and these are easily thought of as little balloons. Each of these balloons is about the size of a grain of sand. And so when we place those in a tissue, they remain in that tissue and they release drug into that tissue at a steady state. Because they're the size of a grain of sand, they actually don't move around. So they stay where we put them. So when they're there, that means that they are in the tissue of the esophagus. So unlike an oral drug where they're coating the surface, here we're actually giving the fluticasone right into where the disease is. So that level where you see the inflammation on biopsy, where you see the scar tissue on biopsy, that's where we live. And that drug is delivering 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 365 days into that tissue at a steady state. And patients, there's no compliance issue. It's put there. They don't have to remember a thing or do a thing. So that's how the drug works. And in a sense, why it works and why you're seeing the analysts and the doctors saying what they're saying, because they're saying, we know this drug works in this disease, and now we're delivering it where we need it. So now let's talk about the delivery piece and the gastroenterologists themselves. So gastroenterologists are inherently proceduralists. Now, they may run an office practice, but their economics are really coming from the procedures that they're doing. They are applying their knowledge and skill in a procedural way to help a patient. They're doing upper endoscopies to evaluate the esophagus and the stomach, and they're doing colonoscopies to evaluate the colon. And so when they do that, they get paid. So we tie, and you can see in the image you brought up here, this is the injection pattern that's being done by the gastroenterologist. So what's happening is instead of saying write a prescription for a drug for which you really don't get compensation for that prescription, you're just billing an office visit, bring that patient in for a procedure they should already be coming for, because the guidelines state, both in Europe and the United States, that you should be going once a year for an endoscopy. But not everybody shows up, because they don't necessarily show up because they don't know why they should show up. Well, if they need to show up in order to get their therapy, you can rest assured they're going to show up. So number one, you deal with compliance for even showing up for your screening visits by using this therapy. That's good for the patients, good for the doctor. Then, while they are doing this procedure, the screening, and you can see here, it's 60% of people who actually show up. So you're trying to aim to capture that other 40%. And for everybody who shows up, you deliver the therapy. Now, they can't feel the therapy being delivered. Number one, they're under anesthetic. And number two, there's no nerve endings in the esophagus to feel a needle or a biopsy. For the physician, it takes 5 to 10 extra minutes. So you might say, well, wait a minute, 5 to 10 extra minutes. I thought this, what about the economics of their practice? Now, so they build their suite economics. They don't know how long a procedure is going to take. So you could say, well, you added 5 minutes, you ruined their economics. The answer is they actually have a lot of flex in their day, because when they do a colonoscopy on someone, they book it. They have no idea if it's going to be normal and there's nothing to do and it took 6 minutes, or if they get in there and there's 15 polyps and they need to take out every single polyp. That might take them 45 minutes. So you can see how they get flex in their day. Some procedures are shorter, some are longer. So they look at the time and say, no big deal. What is a big deal for them, though, is that they get to bill the screening procedure. And then because we're a therapeutic procedure, there's another fee code, and they get to bill them both. So now they're getting procedure fees, physician fees, facility fees, because they're adding this procedure. And then, as you pointed out, there's this additional piece of buy-in bill. So what buy-in bill means is that the physician's office brings the medicine in and has it ready. So you're not going to a pharmacy to get it. The patient comes in. If you need the drug, just like at a hospital, the doctor's got it. Now, the insurance companies, again, whether it's Medicare, Medicaid, or private, recognize that's a burden for the doctor and says, you're now acting a bit as pharmacy here, so we're going to pay you for that. And we're going to pay you, the normal Medicare, Medicaid is ASP plus 6%. Now, private could pay 10, 15, 20. If you think about that, if let's say this drug was $50,000, at 6, that's $3,000. So suddenly, if you're the physician and you're providing better patient care, ideally, more convenient and compliant patient care, and at the same time, your economics are saying, I'm going to get paid for 2 procedures, and I'm going to get to bill this $3,000 plus in addition for 10 minutes of extra work, it becomes this virtuous circle loop. And for the payer, it's also good, even though the doctor's making more money, because you may be paying less for drug costs, number one. But number two, as you pointed out in your introduction, compliance is a real issue in this disease. And if you're a payer, the last thing you want to do is pay for a drug that the patient doesn't take properly, which means you've paid for it, but you're not getting the results. With this, because it's delivered by the doctor on that once a year schedule we anticipate, it really means you're guaranteed compliance. So you're getting what you paid for as the payer. And so all of those verticals, patient, physician, and payer, line up with EP104 based on where we project and hope this product to be.
Right. Okay, that's a great analysis. And I take it we're talking about the U.S. experience. I don't know that Canadian doctors would be able to do the extra billing for the product, but certainly that would be something available to American doctors. Is that something
Correct.
that would be available to GI specialists in Europe or elsewhere as well?
No, they would certainly have extra procedural fees that they could bill.
Yeah,
But no, most of them, the government is busy supplying the drug to the facilities.
sure.
And so the physician is not getting any of that.
It looks like there's a high value commercial opportunity for this drug. How do you see this as a potential market?
We agree. We see this as very high value. And again, we can look back to Crohn's disease. It was an orphan disease for many years, yet now we all know it. And how many people have Crohn's disease? It's roughly 1 million patients in the United States. But yet nobody really knows EoE. That's going to change. It's going to become something that everybody knows about. When we look at inflammatory bowel disease, you've got 6+ blockbuster drugs. So drugs selling $1 billion, $2 billion, $4 billion, $5 billion in IBD. There's room for lots there, and there's many more coming. In EoE, you've got that one drug. And so with that patient population, the need for both more options, more treatment, really with the pricing that's there, the number of patients that are there, and the high unmet medical need, there is room not just for EP104, but I'm sure other people will take different approaches and explore the opportunity. And we hope that they find success for patients. But we believe EP104, how it's delivered and all the things we talked about, most doctors are saying this would be our first line treatment. We would start with EP104. If it's a once a year therapy with fluticasone propionate, we would simply bypass the oral steroids that we know nobody wants to take. And we know we're already doing an endoscopy. We would start with this. And we think that that is a great place for us to be for patients as well as from a commercial perspective.
Okay, that actually makes a lot of sense with the way this drug, if successful, would fit into a GI specialist practice. So let's now talk about the clinical results that we've seen. So you have the Resolve clinical trial, and there's 2 parts to this. The phase 1b/2 trial, which is more of the dose escalation, and I put up a slide. And then you have the phase 2B trial, which is enrolling right now and hope to get some interim results later this year. Can you explain what you've done with your phase 1B2 trial? I know recently you released some results which look very promising, albeit in small numbers.
Yeah. So this trial, this 1B2A, was all about exploring how is it best to give this drug and how much drug do we need to give? And the overarching piece that we took away from this trial is that in general, the more drug you give and the more coverage of the esophagus you have, the better. And so that's led to 20 injections, which is full coverage of the esophagus, and at the highest doses. And when we do that, we end up seeing great efficacy, great safety, and to your point, at very small numbers. And so the phase 2B trial is to basically take the top 2 doses from this trial and examine them, but with power, with numbers.
Right.
And there we're looking at 40 patients on placebo, 40 patients at the 6 milligram dose, the second highest dose from this trial, and then 40 patients at the 8 milligram dose. And so when we look at that trial, one of the things to point out here is we're crossing over the placebo at 6 months. Now, I love this design. I think it's fascinating. When we were talking to ethics committees, there was concern about actually having a placebo for an entire year. And the commentary was, look, your initial data, while small, is showing a really profound clinical improvement. It's also showing an improvement in scar tissue. So we don't want patients getting worse and worse and worse because they chose to participate and got a placebo. So at the 6-month time point, the patient remains blinded. They don't know what group they're in. They go in at 6 months, think they're just getting a routine checkup. During that checkup with the endoscopy, if they were placebo, the administering physician will then cross them over into drug, but not tell the patient. So when we look at the data we're going to have in December, that interim data is a really important data point because it is going to tell us really what's happening in this trial, a look through to what the full trial will be able to tell us, as well as be supportive of us going to the regulatory agencies quickly and early to have discussions about phase 3, about things like fast track designations based on the data that we will have seen to date. And so the data that we expect to see, we'll have about 3/4 of the patients that will have made it to 3 months. We're going to have a little more than half the patients that will have made it to 6 months. About 1/3 of the patients will have made it to 9 months and quite a few at a year. So it's going to give us, if they're at that time point, at that 6-month time point, especially in December, if what we see is a separation from placebo that's meaningful between the placebo and the active, you've got to win. If you see a separation from placebo on the biopsies, so the inflammation and the fibrosis, you've got to win. Because if you're seeing power at that point in the trial, you know that your effect size is very large and you've more than met your minimum bar, which is just to be as good as what's out there today.
That makes a lot of sense. So Q4, you're anticipating December at this point?
We're anticipating December, and we don't see that really changing at this stage.
Okay. So going back to the phase 1B2 trial, and I put up a slide from your presentation. This is a chart titled Clinical Remission Rates. Again, small numbers of patients, but can you explain what it means and what you mean by remission in this disease?
Yeah. So this is looking at a measure called the Straumann Dysphagia Index. Straumann was one of the discoverers of the disease, has been on our clinical advisory board, very helpful in the development of EP104. Both he and Dr. Atwood, who was the other discoverer of this disease. And so this is measuring difficulty swallowing. It basically means you're asking patients how many times a day they had difficulty swallowing. Did they sort of choke on the food? In other words, did it get stuck? If it did, was it stuck with solids? Was it stuck with liquids? What was happening? And that all then translates into a score. So it's a 9-point scale. Most patients are entering the trial at a score of about 6. The definition here of clinical remission is an improvement of 3 points or more. And really what that means is if you're a patient and you've improved 3 points, you don't really notice you have the disease anymore. It means you're eating normally. Instead of avoiding dinner with family and friends, instead of never socializing over a meal, all of a sudden now you're actually living life. And what we see here, and this, we're looking here in order to overcome the small numbers problem. What we did is we said, look, let's put together everybody who got full coverage of the esophagus, basically, or almost full coverage, because we know that that's where this works best. And so what we see is that by week 2, 40% of the patients are in clinical remission. By week 8, we're closer to 60% of patients in clinical remission. And at week 24, 80% are in clinical remission. So first, when we look today at other therapies, when they've looked in their own studies at clinical remission rates, they're seeing rates of 39%, 40%. That's the bar. If you hit 40% clinical remission, you have a commercially successful product. Anything you do better than that is pure upside. And so obviously we hope that we see these results in our phase 2B. But our expectation setting is just to be at that 40% mark. And you can see here that we maintain our levels all the way out to 1 year, really supporting this looks to be a once-a-year product.
Do you have any idea how long it would last if you didn't redose a patient? At 52 weeks, you've got 60+% remission. If you didn't dose them, would it go out for 14 months or 18 months, or have you tested that?
Yeah, so we are testing that as we speak. We've got some ideas based on previous testing and based on the fact that a lot of these patients have reached a year. And so what we're hearing is after they reach a year, somewhere around that 14-month time mark, they're coming back and saying, I've got symptoms back. It's starting again. My disease is coming back. Now, there'll always be a range. And so what we're actually testing now is we're doing long-term follow-up on these patients all the way out to 2 years. We want to track and be able to demonstrate where does the inflammation come back in time? When does the scar tissue start to come back as well as your symptoms? And then we want to be redosing prior to that time point, likely around that 12-month time point.
I see. And so those are all the cohorts. So I've just put up the slide where it's the Straumann dysphagia index, but by cohort.
So this is now looking at the different doses. So rather than having them combined, you're looking at the bigger doses. And what's interesting here is that our 2 highest doses, which are the green and the purple, are behaving as you would expect. They are giving the best response. Now, this is where you also get into small numbers because you'll say, well, the purple is actually a lower dose than the green. Why is it doing better? What's really interesting about this is that our green patients were actually much more severe than our purple patients. They had much worse fibrosis. So the degree to which they're getting better is remarkably impressive considering. And so this, of course, difference gets washed out when you get to larger numbers. What's fascinating is if you look at the next slide, now what you're looking at is biopsies of the tissue. And so here you do see that dose response. So in other words, my highest dose weren't my best in symptoms, but they started as the worst patients. Look at the response they get on histology. So in other words, the improvement in their inflammation and the improvement in their scar tissue, their fibrosis. The red, that represents about the level that current therapies are providing in terms of this metric, the EoE HSS. As we get to higher doses, what we're seeing is a larger response. So the yellow is representing about a 75% reduction in inflammation and scar tissue. And the green is representing about a 90 to 95% reduction from baseline. So that means that these people, their esophagus is almost becoming normal. And that's why their symptoms are getting better. And when we were talking about symptoms, there was a big difference between 2 weeks and 6 months. This is why we can reduce inflammation really quickly. Scar tissue takes months to resolve. But basically, once we get to 6 months, that's as good as we're going to make you. After that, our drug has made you as good as it's going to.
So what are you seeing with respect to scar tissue?
So we are seeing resolution of the scar tissue in most of the patients at these higher doses. And so that's visible here, as you can see on biopsy. The other thing that's interesting is patients are entering this trial with things called strictures. So a stricture is a narrowing of scar tissue, but it's a focal narrowing. So it's a ring, basically, in the esophagus that's really tight and full of scar tissue. Now, those can happen in EoE. Those can also happen in lots of other diseases as well. In fact, it's a huge problem. There's 1 million patients who have benign esophageal strictures, meaning it's not from cancer, in the United States. The treatment for them is ballooning because they have no way of getting rid of the scar tissue. So 500,000 patients a year are going to a gastroenterologist, getting a scope, and having a balloon tear their tissue just so they can swallow.
Wow.
What are we seeing? Patients are entering our trial with those strictures and they're disappearing. So the physicians have come to us and said, we haven't seen this before. So they've now come to us and said, those 500,000 patients that we have that have benign esophageal strictures, we actually already use an injectable steroid. In other words, the procedure we're doing, injecting steroid, they're already
Yes.
doing it. But they're using a steroid that only lasts 1 day. Even a steroid that lasts only 1 day is making a big difference. So it is standard of care. So they've come to us and said, we want to run a study with your drug in these 500,000 patients. Now, Dupixent is not in that space. There is not a single drug in that space that's on label, and nobody's testing it. And so you imagine then, we already talked about how big the EoE market is. If you think about a $50,000 price point and you've got 500,000 patients that don't even have EoE, that just have these benign esophageal strictures, if you get 20,000 of them, that's $1 billion in sales. So all of a sudden, this starts to become a very big market in the gastroenterology space. EoE, benign esophageal strictures, and they're also talking about Crohn's disease with us. And so I'll come back then to this data point that we have in December and why it matters. It matters as a first order because it's going to tell us about what's happening in EoE with power. It also matters because if it's positive, as we hope and expect it to be, at that level that says you're at least as good as anything else out there and you're changing the tissue, at least as good as the red bar here, that means that you've also immediately opened the door and made it very likely that you're going to work in benign esophageal strictures and fibrostenosing Crohn's, which means you're tripling the total addressable market by adding those two things. And from a commercial perspective, you're talking about a sales force talking to the exact same doctors, now about 3 conditions, selling them the same drug at the same price, delivered exactly the same way with the same economic benefit for that doctor. And that's where suddenly this moves from EoE to gastroenterology very, very quickly.
Have you made a decision as of yet to begin a clinical trial for benign esophageal strictures, or are you going to wait for the data from your phase 2b trial in December?
Well, lucky for us, the timing actually aligns. So we're working with the top key opinion leaders in the world on trial designs, both for benign esophageal strictures, as well as for fibrostenosing Crohn's. We're going to be taking those trials into the regulatory agencies for approval to start them. They won't start until after that interim data, but we're doing all the work now. It's usually, think of it as 6 to 9 months of prep work from I'd like to do a trial to I can actually do a trial. And we're busy doing all that work today. And we have, with the 134 million we have in the bank, we have the money not just to do EoE, but also to add these other phase 2 programs in these other indications without having to fortify the balance sheet.
Right. At least start that process.
Correct. Yes.
I think you've guided that you've got funding to sometime in 2028.
Correct. Q3 of 28.
Where do you go from here, assuming success in your phase 2b?
Yeah. So assuming success, again, the bar for success is 40% of patients in clinical remission. You're seeing, a bit of change in tissue. What that means is we would then go to the FDA, show them that data, and that data should be supportive of a single registrational phase 3. Again, this drug is well known. They know this drug. This drug is used in this disease. So a single trial, probably of around 300 patients. We estimate the safety database requirements. Look, if the data's phenomenal, they may say you need fewer patients than that. And then we would begin that trial in mid 27. We anticipate about 18 months to run the trial to where we'd have the data for our NDA submission. Would be 9 months of recruitment, 6 months of follow-up, 3 months to clean up the data and have that data. So 18 months from start to top line data from that, which would then form the basis of our NDA submission. We would continue to follow patients all the way out through a year. And again, what we've noticed is the first 6 months is the critical piece. And we really already kind of have that long-term data that's telling us that. And we'll have a lot of that from this phase 2 study where we'll have patients who we will have followed for years by the time we submit our NDA.
Okay. Well, look, potentially very exciting. And of course, as you indicated a few minutes ago, if your phase 2b data is successful, that would be very encouraging to expand the drug to other indications. I did notice that you have recently filed a short form prospectus.
Yes.
To raise up to $300 million US. Obviously, it doesn't require you to do anything, but what are your thoughts about raising the necessary funds to do all of this? And I've thrown up a slide about your pipeline, et cetera.
Perfect. I think that for us, we talked about gastroenterology. There are a lot of other places we can go, and we're starting to get asked that question. Can you be in cancer? Can you be here? Can you be there? The answer is yes. And we have a skunkworks team that are busy working away. We don't talk about it very much because there's not much point today, but we have things in the background that we can advance very quickly, provided the capital is available. Now, capital being available from the people you want at the price you want, those are different issues. We really like our balance sheet today because what it says is we have the ability to continue to drive value, move through milestones without having to raise money until, at least the latter half of 2027. With the number of milestones between now and then, we would hope that there would be the right balance of interest and stock price that we hope our cost of capital would be much less than it is today and be then a great opportunity for new investors to come in, as well as not being punishing for existing investors. And we think that threads the needle well and would allow us to not just finish development on EoE and GI, but also then expand into other really interesting areas.
That's potentially very exciting. So we talked about the existing competition, Dupixent and corticosteroids, et cetera. Are you aware of other potential competition to your drug that's out there in clinical development?
So there's not really very much out there in clinical development right now. There were several drugs in EoE trials. All of those failed. They made a good difference in eosinophils, but they didn't make a difference in how patients feel and that change in inflammation and scar tissue. There is a drug by Amgen called Tezspire. They're running a trial right now in EoE. It targets something called the TSLP. From what we hear from KOLs, there's not a high degree of optimism that it will perform as well as Dupixent. And then there's one other drug that is like a proton pump inhibitor. So it's kind of in that family that's been on the market already for reflux. And they're trialing it to see if it's better than existing proton pump inhibitors in EoE. The view from the experts in the field is that it's unlikely that will provide a meaningful advance in therapy, but may provide a better option for that first line proton pump inhibitor. And that's really it. There's not much else out there in this space right now. There may be some people that are 5 years behind, but nobody else around us in terms of timing other than as described.
Okay, terrific. So assuming you are successful, your intellectual property is going to be very important. But what is your intellectual property? Can you describe it?
Absolutely. So We have 5 patent families that cover the EP104 product. That starts with a composition of matter patent. So that means the Diffusphere itself, what that looks like and sort of what it is. That's covered by patents that are granted all around the world. We also have coverage on the manufacturing process. In other words, what we learned, not just in discovering this, but in how you go from making this in a lab, which is one thing, to making it at commercial scale. So how do you actually make this so that you can make millions of doses? Well, that took us years and millions of dollars to be able to figure that out. And we were doing some very unique things. So we have patents that cover that. We also have trade secrets. Now, those trade secrets can in the future become patents, further extending that. We also then have patents on the method by which we deliver this, on the drug delivery profile, so that flat line for 52 weeks, just novel and unusual. And so patents there. That takes us through to the mid-2040s without any adjustments and extensions. Then you go to the next stage, which is, how does someone copy this? So let's say you're a generics maker. Your business model is short trials, no risk, and print out cheap pills or cheap injections. The way they do that is they copy your drug, and then they show that they deliver the same way as you. And then they say, look, we deliver the same way in animals and in humans, approve us. So if you've got a drug that lasts 8 hours, like ibuprofen, that's easy. If you've got a drug that lasts a week, it's a 1-week-long trial. We last a year. They're going to have to run animal trials and human trials that demonstrate the bioequivalence for at least 12 months. And they're going to have to show exactly the same pattern. That's a huge risk for them. First, you're talking about 4 years of development, even for a generic. That's not the business model of a generics company. They're not going to do that. By the way, this isn't a unique to us thing. Long-acting drugs, meaning 3 months or greater, very rarely get genericized for exactly that reason.
Your point's well taken. I just want to briefly go over your corporate structure. I did take a peek at it and I was reviewing some of the materials. So you've got about 65.9 million common shares outstanding and about 8.3 million preference shares. And I looked at it and it looked like the preference shares can be converted to common shares. And you have about 1.4 million pre-funded warrants, which I look at it essentially as common shares because they can be converted for a penny a share.
Yep.
So effectively about 75.6 million common shares or equivalents, and there's some other things, some options and Class B shares, etc. But essentially it looks like you've got about 76 million common shares or equivalent. And at your current US share price as of last night, it looks like your market cap is just over 500 million US.
Totally agree with your math. Yep.
Okay. All right. And as you mentioned earlier, you have about 133.7 million US as of June 30th, and you indicate that should take you to Q3 of 2028. So you've got some room. I'm going to wrap up fairly quickly here, but I just want to summarize. You've got some upcoming catalysts, and we've gone over it, but you've got ongoing quarterly readouts still from your phase 1b/2a trial. And of course, the big one is your phase 2b Resolve trial with interim results expected in December. And that should be quite material for the company. And it looks like you have the initiation of a clinical trial for an additional indication in the second half of 26. And I assume that's for the esophageal strictures, but...
Correct. Yes.
Okay. All right. These are terrific. I won't go into everything we've discussed about what's going to happen next year because it's all going to be dependent on your outcome of your phase 2b results in December. So I'm quite excited about that. Is there anything else that you think we should cover?
I think you've asked all the right questions. It was a great discussion, a real pleasure to be here. And as you say, I mean, this is going to be a very exciting year. I think what gives us sort of calm as we look forward and anticipate the phase 2b results is, number one, the phase 2a results. But number two is we're using fluticasone propionate, which is known to work in this disease, well recognized, and really just using the Diffusphere technology to deliver it in a more convenient, better way. So we're really looking forward to the fall and to the December readout and what we get to do in 2027.
I'm excited for you as well. I do have some disclaimer comments. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered a recommendation to buy or sell securities in Eupraxia Pharmaceuticals. Eupraxia is a clinical stage pre-commercial biotech company, which should be considered a high-risk investment. The various risks are explained by Eupraxia in its various securities filings available on sedar.com. And please do your own due diligence and speak to your financial advisor before making an investment in Eupraxia. I am independent of Eupraxia and am not being paid by them for making this podcast. So with that, James, thank you so much. It was a terrific interview.
Stephen, thank you very much. I really appreciate the time. It was a great pleasure. And thank you to everybody listening.
Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.